You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having
not
cards.
playing cards.
Right now, you don't.
Very
You're playing
serious,
cards.
Mr. President.
You're
I'm
playing
very
cards.
serious.
You're gambling
I'm
with the
president
lives
of
of
the world.
millions of people.
You think
You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country. This country.
We are currently watching Trump turn away in supporting Ukraine from a Russian invasion, while simultaneously giving Israel $3 billion to continue their own invasion of Gaza. This based new right doesn't want war, unless it's Israel. But before Trump, things were equally as confusing. During the previous administration, Biden gave Israel $17 billion to carry out an offensive invasion of a largely civilian population in the Gaza Strip.
I'm going to ask the United States Congress for an unprecedented support package for Israel's defense,
while simultaneously giving Ukraine $66 billion in aid to defend themselves from an invasion by Russian aggressors.
Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine continues, and Putin wants nothing less to destroy Ukraine's culture. Ukraine can and will stop Putin.
In both cases, Israel comes out on the top, so I guess there is one consistency amongst all the confusion. Death, taxes, and U.S. aid to Israel. Now, we all know ideological inconsistencies are as American as apple pie. Those who claim they want peace, funding wars. Those who claim they care about children, paying to blow them up. You know the story at this point. But these are only inconsistencies when viewing geopolitics through a strictly ethical lens. Remove those goggles and look at the world without mainstream media programming, and what you see in Israel and Ukraine are two client states. The definition of a client state is a state that is economically, politically, and/or militarily subordinated to a more powerful controlling state. Any nation designated client state status by America is basically used to extract resources as well as suppress any leftist alternatives to capitalism abroad. Probably the most basic historical examples of this would be the way the United States used Latin America throughout the 20th century. A country such as Cuba or Chile would have abundant natural resources that American businesses wanted to own and profit off of. In order to do so, they need a government and a leader in those Latin countries to allow them access to those resources. But in Latin America, a lot of the leaders didn't want Americans owning their country's resources. Instead, they favored nationalizing their industries, such as oil or transportation systems, so that their own people would profit and own them. Wait, they want to profit and own their own resources? But how does America make money if they do that? America has many ways in which they can get what they want, most of which don't even involve firing a single bullet, believe it or not. This is sometimes called soft power. Because of America's unfathomable level of wealth and power, the colonialist juggernaut is able to inflict economic harm on smaller nations through sanctions, such as tariffs or trade embargoes, that cripple economies and make life very hard on its citizens. This puts pressure on the country's civilian population to vote out the leader in charge in exchange for relief from America's sanctions. A type of hostage situation, if you will. Sometimes America will go a step further and heavily fund a pro-American puppet leader that runs against or outright overthrows the current leader. From 1946 to the year 2000, the United States undertook over 80 election interference operations around the world. Once this process is successful, a puppet leader installed, and the sovereign nation's resources opened up to the Western power elite to profit off of, that nation officially becomes a client state. From here, they become a chess piece for Western empire. Ukraine and Israel are two current cases of client states. In this episode, I will go over Ukraine and its client state status, and how it contributed to the tragic war it's currently facing with Russia. Next episode, we'll look at Israel and why it's America's favorite client state, granting it special privilege. If Israel is America's wifey, then Ukraine is its side bitch. Formerly a part of the Soviet Union until its collapse in 1991, Ukraine sits on the border of Russia and the beginning of the East. The country is valuable to the US and its power elite rulers, both because of its access to natural resources such as oil and lithium, but also because of the strategic position it offers in a potential conflict against Russia. After leaving the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine became allies with the US. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, the US attempted to bring Ukraine into NATO, which would have basically converted it from an Eastern country to a Western country. Ukraine being a part of NATO would have meant that Americans could place nukes in their country and be entitled to other strategic advantages that could threaten Russia's national security. However, Ukraine, only a couple years removed from being a Soviet state, mostly remained a Russian-aligned culture throughout this time. In order to woo the country and transform its formerly Soviet population into sophisticated, modern, Western people, the United States employed the use of NGOs. Another tool of Western imperialism, NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, are private companies whose goals are social instead of financial profit. They are formed by wealthy special interests to advance a very specific cause. Ukraine was flooded with American NGOs in the 90s and 2000s. And if you look into these organizations such as National Endowment for Democracy or National Democratic Institute, not to be confused with International Republican Institute, it's hard to understand what it is they actually do. But one thing is for certain, all of these NGOs are loaded with cash and spend that cash promoting ambiguous ideas of democracy, election integrity, strengthening civil society. This includes, but is not limited to, training activists or funding independent media. Imagine someone doing that in America. This sort of ambiguity around the exact nature of NGOs' involvement abroad has historically been a strength. During the Cold War, the NGOs would often act as Trojan horses for clandestine CIA activity. Now, do I personally think the NGOs that flooded Ukraine in the 90s and 2000s were the CIA? Not necessarily. They come later. But I do believe that when investing boatloads of money in creating activists and independent media in foreign countries, you want a return on your investment, don't you? So although a decade of US and NGO efforts were starting to make a dent in the transformation of the Ukrainian culture, the former Soviet state mostly remained a Russian-aligned country, particularly the east and southern regions. And in 2004, the country even briefly elected a pro-Russia president named Viktor Yanukovych. Yanukovych opposed his country joining NATO and rejected Western integration. He was Russia's preferred candidate and offered a return to tradition for the region. After being elected in 2004, a mass protest movement immediately erupted as the election was disputed on the grounds of allegations of election irregularities. This protest would become known as the Orange Revolution. And if you're keeping track, this seems to be where the NGO's investment begins paying off. Two of the leading activist groups that both took to the streets, Pora and Znayo, were both trained, organized, and received funding from the American NGOs. These also include groups who sounded the alarm on alleged election irregularities, as they were tasked to monitor the election using methods and organization structures taught to them and funded by these same American NGOs. You can start to see the tinfoil hat forming. Now, regardless of whether or not you believe that America helped overturn the election and install a puppet leader to serve their interests, something they've done in many other countries, just take a second and imagine the roles are reversed, right? And another country such as Russia or Saudi Arabia had a group of sophisticated nerds teaching American activists how to organize and monitor elections nationally. It's not a great look, no matter how you spin it. So, in response to the protest movement and the accusations of election interference, the newly elected pro-Russia candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, was quickly thrown out by the Ukrainian Supreme Court and replaced with the Western-aligned Viktor Yushchenko. To all my fellow smooth-brained Western Americans, it's a similar name, but they are different people. However, Ukraine's Western shift would be short-lived as pro-Russia candidate Viktor Yanukovych would once again return and be elected in 2010, this time with no immediate pushback from the populace. Now, as president, once again, Yanukovych would go on to back away from NATO and begin to return Ukraine toward Russia and its eastern influences. And this led to a crucial inflection point in 2013 when the Ukrainian president was offered the EU Association Agreement from the European Union and its allies in the US State Department. If signed, this would have officially brought Ukraine further into the embrace of the West and moved the country one giant step further to finally joining NATO and the rest of the Western world. Yanukovych's allies in Moscow strongly opposed the deal. After all, Russia, above all else, does not want a NATO country sitting on its borders. And if you're confused as to why Russia wouldn't want that, just Google the Cuban Missile Crisis and learn about how the planet almost ended when Cuba allowed Soviets to put missiles so close to America's borders. So President Yanukovych decided to reject the EU Association Agreement and maintain his allegiance to Russia. This triggered yet another mass protest, this time called the Euromaidan protests. You know the story at this point. Western-leaning Ukrainians and students took to the streets, shut down public functions, and demanded President Yanukovych resign from office. Now, to zoom out for a second, I think it's unfair to suggest that the US is solely responsible for these uprisings. Cultural moments like this, after all, are the result of countless factors, most of which are impossible to plan for. And the genuine split in attitudes toward the future of Ukraine amongst its citizens can't be discredited either. President Yanukovych had a bad history of corruption and authoritarianism. He was linked with Russian oligarchs and all sorts of unsavory characters. However, this is also exactly how the US's soft power works. It's a long-term game built on investments and shaping culture to promote the results the American empire desires. Rather than military intervention, America plays the long game by investing in shaping crucial cultural institutions like media, entertainment, and tradition, especially aimed at the younger generations. By its own accounting, since 1991, the US had spent $5 billion on initiatives to move Ukraine westward and toward NATO. If you strategically inundate the population of a smaller nation like Ukraine with this soft power for 2 decades, then it's bound to take root in the minds of those who grew up inundated with it. So when their pro-Russian president wanted to move their culture away from what they had been inundated with, then the natural response was to revolt. The US doesn't need to fire a single shot, they already won. And when they did, the Euromaidan protest movement collapsed President Yanukovych's government and he fled to Russia. Leaked phone calls from the height of the protests reveal Americans had a hands-on role in picking the former president's replacement. In the phone call, you can literally hear the US Assistant Secretary of State and the US Ambassador to Ukraine actively discuss who they should pick to lead Ukraine. It's truly wild stuff.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside.
I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing.
And Ukraine listened to their American handlers and once again installed, this time, a far-right, pro-Western leader named Arseniy Yatsenyuk. Not even 1 week after the collapse of the democratically elected government in Ukraine, and Russian President Vladimir Putin did the impossible. He invaded and annexed a part of Ukraine called Crimea. And this was the first time since World War II that a European country forcefully seized the territory of another. In radical contrast to the US's soft power strategy, Putin sent 20,000 Russian troops into Crimea, took over all government buildings, and then forced the population to vote for their own annexation. This Russian act of aggression would be followed up by a speech from President Putin, in which he said that his country's actions were a direct result of NATO's presence and incursion into Ukraine, one of several warnings issued by the Russian president. This represented a deadly serious escalation in the battle for Ukraine's future. However, who exactly was at immediate risk of this escalation was of interest to the orcs running the US State Department. Now, at this juncture, there is great debate as to whether or not the invasion of Crimea, as well as the future military actions Russia would eventually take, were provoked or not. Within the mainstream Western media, there is near unanimous coordinated messaging about how Putin was committing an act of war to expand the Russian Empire and conquer Ukraine. After all, what Russia did was violent and violated international law. But I don't think you can say it wasn't provoked. Putin is on record as publicly stating that he and his government viewed any NATO expansion in Ukraine as a direct threat to Russia's security at least 5 separate times throughout history. 2007, 2008, 2014, July 2021, and December 2021. All warnings ignored by the West, who in that same period of time never ceased pursuing its NATO aspirations for Ukraine.
You talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You have to call it the unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's a very interesting phrase. Why? because they know perfectly well it's provoked. That doesn't justify it, but it was massively provoked. Top U.S. diplomats have been talking about this for 30 years. Yes, it's provoked and it's crazy. It's reckless. Right-wing people like Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense under Bush, said this is crazy. It's reckless, provocative to invite Ukraine into NATO. No Russian leader will ever accept it. Massively provoked. So therefore, we have to call it the unprovoked invasion. I mean, any good shrink could tell you what's going on,
I believe that from the view of the Western imperialists running the Fourth Reich at the time, here was an opportunity to finally fight Russia and to do so without spilling a single drop of American blood. That's a rare opportunity for them.
The United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here.
Russia's invasion of Crimea was yet another inflection point, a moment where concessions could have been made, such as enshrining Ukrainian neutrality and pulling back its NATO influences, or just anything to work toward peace. But the opposite happened, and from 2014 onward, war effectively begins in Ukraine. The US and other NATO-aligned countries in the EU hit Russia with a mountain of sanctions designed to cripple their economy. I mentioned earlier that the CIA would eventually get involved, as they always tend to do around these sorts of issues. This is that time. After Russia's annexation of Crimea, the Central Intelligence Agency officially touches down on Ukrainian soil, establishing a network of 12 secret bases along the Russian border. This rare opportunity allowed the US Intelligence Department unprecedented access to monitor and spy on their enemy in the East. The entire intelligence and surveillance apparatus built by the CIA remains the primary source used today by Ukrainians. The next phase of the war took place 1 month later in the furthest eastern regions of Ukraine, as pro-Russian separatists took over more government buildings and declared independence from Ukraine. In response, Ukraine designated the separatist terrorists and sent the notorious neo-Nazi Azaz Battalion, who received direct training from the US military, by the way. They sent these neo-Nazis into Donbass to reclaim the territory. And just a little side note, Ukraine has a neo-Nazi problem, which is maybe a different video. Look it up. Russia would retaliate by sending 5,000 of its own troops dressed as volunteers. This was basically so that they could say that they didn't technically have soldiers across enemy lines, but it's widely regarded as bullshit. After months of heavy fighting, the Donbass War eventually resulted in the deaths of 14,400 people and more than 1 million Ukrainians displaced. Aside from providing intelligence and military training, America is also providing Ukraine with substantial financial assistance at this point. In 2015, there's finally a break in the war as both Ukraine and Russia tentatively agree to terms outlined in the Minsk agreements, which include a full ceasefire, prisoner exchange, scaling back of heavy weapons, among many other things. While there are small skirmishes, the war is essentially a stalemate during this time. Now, here we reach yet another crucial inflection point where you'd think surely, would have been a perfect time to come to the table and end this war. Well, the Fourth Reich in the West was not yet satisfied.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he never planned to honor the 2014-2015 Minsk agreements to create peace between Russia, he said in a recent interview with a German magazine. While he never planned to honor the agreements, he was elected on the promise of ending the Donbass War.
It's been revealed from the lips of multiple Western leaders, including Zelensky and then German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Since its signing, the West never intended to truly honor the Minsk agreement and end the war. Instead, the West used the peace process to buy time while NATO armed Ukraine and trained its military for all-out war with Russia. In 2017, during this time of supposed peace, the Trump administration, of all people, would deliver Ukraine $2.5 billion in military assistance. This included the first official shipment of lethal weapons to the country, that again was supposed to be in the midst of a peace agreement with its opponent. Javelin missiles, sniper rifles, grenade launchers, patrol boats, all Call of Duty shit. Trump kitted them out. And then as soon as Biden takes office in 2021, an additional $385 million worth of weapons are shipped to Ukraine. The U.S. Assistant Secretary of State around this time would publicly brag on the Senate floor about investing $266 million into training Ukrainians' police officers, while also embedding U.S. advisors in 12 different ministries across the war-torn country.
and U.S. advisors serve in almost a dozen Ukrainian ministries and localities. With U.S. help, newly vetted and trained police officers are patrolling the streets of 18 Ukrainian cities. And since there can be no reform in Ukraine without security, over $266 million of our support has been in the security sector, training 1,200 soldiers and 750 Ukrainian National Guard personnel, and supplying life-saving gear.
Vladimir Zelensky is elected president of Ukraine in 2019 with 73% of the vote, in large part based on his promise to work out an arrangement with Russia that would end the war. This could have been enacting all the terms drafted out in the Minsk agreement, including, probably most crucially and controversially, giving the Russians complete autonomy over the Donbass region. As Ukraine was being stockpiled by the West during this time of, again, supposed peace, Russian President Putin would issue his last and final warning to NATO in December of 2021. Putin presented the United States and NATO with a set of security demands that included a guarantee that Ukraine would never join NATO. Otherwise, the country of Russia would be forced to take military measures if the demands were not met. The demands were not met. On February 24, 2022, Russia officially invaded Ukraine. The following 3 years would see the Biden administration send an unprecedented amount of military aid, equaling approximately $60 billion, and the war resulting in close to 1 million casualties.
We're losing no lives in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are fighting heroically against Russia that has 1,500 nuclear weapons aimed at us. It's like, so we're diminishing and devastating the Russian military for a very small amount of money relative to what we spend in the rest of defense. A weakened Russia is a good thing. And the best thing we can do for America is to see people who have nuclear weapons aimed at us getting weaker.
It is of my personal opinion that the United States exploited Ukraine by using the smaller nation as a proxy in a conflict with their eastern enemy, Russia. Ukrainian soldiers and citizens were sacrificed to degrade Russian military resources and justify sanctions. At every moment in which peace or concessions could have been made between the two warring nations, the US and its allies in the EU repeatedly pushed forward with reckless abandonment of Ukrainian lives while sacrificing nothing of their own. Ukrainian soldiers and civilian populations were used as sacrificial lambs in order to make a dent in Russia's pocket, and this was done with no end in sight. I truly don't believe anyone actually thought Ukraine could come out on top in that conflict. And this is straight out of the Fourth Reich playbook. Diet fascism. No longer do the ruling class fight their own wars and pay the price like they did with Vietnam and Iraq. Now they outsource suffering to weaker, more vulnerable nations under the guise of aid when they, the ruling global colonial force, are largely the creators of the very conditions in which the aid is aiding. All of which is then filtered through a complex network of propaganda that protects the coddled Western consumers from the horrors of the rest of the world's reality, ultimately framing the entire conflict as a political issue, in which the faces of the two American parties tell their followers how to feel about it. This partisan impulse is the reason libs find themselves outraged that this war is potentially, hopefully, ending. And that's because Trump is the one potentially ending it. But why is Trump, the current president of the Fourth Reich, now withdrawing from this conflict? Especially after just handing over $3 billion to Israel for the purpose of destroying Gaza. It's obviously not an anti-war move. I think what we are witnessing here is a significant change in which the colonial ambitions of the power elite are less defined by historical conceptions of nations or allies and enemies, and now firmly fixed on profit. In the absence of geopolitical posturing for a war that may never come, Ukraine has nothing for Trump to profit from. A major example of this can be found in the different types of aid packages both nations receive. The weapons sent to Ukraine mostly come from pre-existing stockpiles and do not develop any immediate profit for American weapon manufacturers and defense contractors. In other words, the weapons going to Ukraine were already paid for by past US defense budgets. Israel, on the other hand, is giving grants from the US government that stipulates they must use the money to purchase new weapons directly from the US defense contractors, guaranteeing steady profit for companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon. So unless Ukraine agrees to give Trump a profit motive in the form of, say, mineral leases for the lithium, then there is no longer any financial upside to supporting their nation's war. For Trump, that is. While all modern presidents bow at the altar of global capitalism, the paradigm in which they navigate their policies has seemed to evolve over time. The paranoid narrative of the Cold War, in which all of America's decisions were made in the name of defeating their communist enemies to the east and preventing nuclear annihilation, whatever, that's effectively melted away. We saw the limits of this paradigm with the Bush-Obama's respective versions of war on terror in the Middle East and Africa. In the era of WikiLeaks and big tech, the colonialist nightmare came into sharp 1080p HD focus right on your smartphone. And the soft-bellied American consumer had a tough time stomaching what they were watching. But don't get it twisted, Trump's subsequent ascendance was not a course correction. Instead, it was an acceptance of the ugly truth at the heart of the American empire. Get money. And furthermore, stop pretending that there is anything else on this planet that matters. Allies and enemies, those are gay, woke things reserved for the woke DEI Hollywood movies. Cut out the middleman, straight to the source. Main line, straight to the vein. Mask off. At the end of the day, Trump is a profoundly unserious monster of a person who has only had his own interests in mind his entire career. I get it. But if the results of those interests, in this case, happen to be less human beings sent into a meat grinder, then that is objectively a good thing, in my opinion. The reality of these situations is that there are no clear-cut good guys and bad guys. Reality is chaos, and will never fit perfectly in the binary box that our partisan media tries to force us in. I think whether it's Gaza or Ukraine, the number one best outcome is always the one that kills less people. One thing remains consistent, though, and that's the people in charge of the empire do not care about people, period. We are cattle to them. We are pawns on a chessboard.